I'm Fletcher Roden, and this is Tracking the Lone Wolf, based on my new book, Tracking the Lone Wolf, the Sigma at work, at home, and at play. Today on Tracking the Lone Wolf, manager, leader, or boss. Tracking the Lone Wolf is a new twice-monthly show which has invaluable information for just about anyone, so I suggest that you like this video and subscribe to the channel. The book is available in paperback, for Kindle, and also in audiobook format from Audible or other platforms. I'm a public speaker, and I invite you to the website trackingthelonewolf.com for more information. So, manager, leader, or boss? Well, first, let's talk about a boss. Are you the boss? The boss has coercive power. The power to punish, the power to reward. But the boss has inferred power. It's inferred on them. They generally do not have the trust of those who follow them. I use the word follow loosely because people don't follow a boss, they obey a boss. People follow a leader. They follow a manager. But they obey the boss. Now we've looked at the alpha personality type, and this is oftentimes a personality type who assumes the role of boss. The alpha does not like to be contested, neither does the boss. The alpha has old-fashioned notions of power structures and hierarchies, so does a boss. The alpha has notions of stasis, which are required for their position, so does a boss. The alpha has insecurities that the boss has. Think of Tony Soprano from The Sopranos. Well, he was the boss, and he was an alpha male. But he was not ultimately a successful leader or a successful father, nor did he ultimately have a successful social life. We'll talk more about him in another episode. But if you're a boss, you might want to reconsider whether or not that's really what you should be. Instead of a boss, what about a manager or a leader? Now let's talk about a boss in the professional theater. We've done that. This is someone who commands and demands respect, even if they haven't earned it. This is a person who believes by the virtue of their position, they deserve the respect. Now, their position does deserve respect. Whether or not the person who occupies the position deserves respect is something else again. And you may find that the person who is in the position of manager or leader or boss is really just a delta who doesn't deserve the power and may be misusing it. The boss at home is going to be the intolerant parent. This is also very often a delta or an alpha. It's my way or the highway. It's this way because I say it is. Don't you cry or I'll give you something to cry about. So, this is when the boss is in charge. You may very well have a delta or an alpha. Almost certainly you do. But this can be terribly problematic. In social circles as well. Nobody needs a boss. Nobody needs to be bossed around. You're not the boss of me. Dating as well. Are you dating someone who's bossy? Anyone like to be bossed around while they're dating? the world really has little place for a boss, frankly. And as Tony Soprano found out, there are only two ways that winds up. So let's talk about leadership and management. The basic difference here is that a leader seeks change. Think of a civil rights leader. Or think of a military leader. These people seek to change the balance of power in some way. They are leading a movement in order to enact change, to upset the status quo. That's when leadership is required. Management seeks to maintain the status quo. Management seeks the opposite of leadership. Management seeks the lack of change, but leadership seeks change. So, these things are both important. The only question is, where and when? Sometimes you need a leader. If you are a new company with a pioneering technology, then you are a leader. Your company may assume a leadership role in the corporate landscape, but it still requires management internally. Every manager can't be a leader of their own company. Every manager does their part to see to it that the company prevails. The company is the leader, which requires managers to keep the operation running smoothly. That's the status quo. Now keep in mind also that any company anywhere, families too, and social circles in every theater of life that we are looking at, there is a culture and a climate. So let's look at a corporation. There's a corporate culture. Those are its founding principles. Something like Disney, which is a family-based company, is going to have a corporate culture. Likewise, something like Ben & Jerry's, which would have a different corporate culture. One would be based on more conservative values and another on more progressive values. But each endure a climate. Now, climate changes. Corporate culture doesn't change. Just as more often than not, familial culture doesn't change. If your familial culture is, let's just say, Catholic, then it's likely to stay Catholic. It may not. Your generations may dilute it or rebel against it. There's no guarantees in life. But cultures are less likely to change. Climates change all the time. Climates change in some parts of the world 4 times a year, sometimes 4 times a day. So climate is necessarily sort of a process, and culture is sort of a fixed mindset, or sort of a system. Any culture has a system mindset and a fixed mindset, and climate has a necessarily process-oriented, growth-minded, flexible mindset. It has to, because climates necessarily change, and cultures do not necessarily change. In fact, they rarely do. So, looking at this dichotomy, you can see that if you're a leader, you're looking at changing the culture. But if you're a manager, you're looking at resisting the climate. if that makes any sense. So I hope you see how all these things kind of fall together. And in the workplace, the climate is going to be volatile, but the culture will not. Likewise in the home. The culture of your home is likely to stay the same, but the climate is likely to be turbulent, depending on the changing times and the growth period of the children, where they're at. That's going to change the climate of the household. But the culture of the household will likely remain the same. So you'll either want to be a leader or a manager, depending on which is more turbulent. Are you having a tumultuous climate? Then that's going to require management. Are you having a crisis of culture? That'll require a leader. Socially, you don't need leaders as much. But social circles do have a culture, and they do have a climate. And there can be storms between people, feuds. You might have friends who get together in a romance and then they break up, and that causes a climate disruption in your social circle. This can happen. It happens in romances. A romance can have a cultural grounding and still have climatic change. So whether or not you are fixed-minded or process-minded really depends on whether or not you are facing a cultural crisis or a climate crisis. And that will determine whether or not you need to be a leader or a manager. Make sense? Okay, let's bring it to the Sigma. The Sigma will lead if they have to, not a natural leader. The Sigma is less tied to culture than to climate, because the lone wolf is not so much a social animal, which means culture, which is a social manifestation, is not as crucial to the lone wolf. The lone wolf is more vulnerable to the climate than to the culture. More interested in the climate. They're perceptive in judgment of things which change, and that tends to be climate. So if you're dealing with a lone wolf or a Sigma, be aware of how they will respond. They are better managed than led, because their concern is more climate oriented than culturally oriented. And the lone wolf resists being led, resists being managed too. But the lone wolf understands management. Questions leadership, but naturally supports management, because the lone wolf, you remember, has an active social conscience and wants to help people and has an inclination toward conflict resolution, and that's management. Conflict creation, that's leadership. Now, the lone wolf, the Sigma, will lead, will assume leadership role when necessary, but only when necessary. The Sigma withdraws from leadership when possible. And this is why. More attuned to management, because more attuned to climate. Less attuned to culture, so less attuned to leadership. It all works together. I hope you'll see as these episodes go on how these things all work together. It brings us to the end of our study of manager, leader, manager, boss. Put them in any order you like. It doesn't matter to me. You can read a lot more about this, though, in my book, Tracking the Lone Wolf, the Sigma at work, at home, and at play. It's available in paperback and for Kindle and audiobook format from Audible and other platforms. Visit the website, trackingthelonewolf.com. I'm Fletcher Roden, and this has been Tracking the Lone Wolf. See you next time.